Yes, and I think, since we are talking about literature and resistance, it is, I don't know whether it changes anything, but it lets you live.
Doesn't change anything, but it lets you live. And then there are those whose lives you're telling who don't get to live. It's a Faustian bargain. It's almost, I certainly find, as a documenter of human rights violations, that there is a sense of unease, of dis-ease, almost of guilt, as you are engaging in this exercise, because at some level it seems voyeuristic, because it is not your suffering, and in the process of presenting this person, are you humanizing them or are you objectifying them? Exactly what you need to say. When you bring them to a literary festival, when you take them to a TV show, when you organize a seminar with these people, what exactly is it that you are doing, particularly to an audience which is not, as you said, Selma, of the initiated. It is an audience that comes in and that is going to view perhaps these people as exhibit A, B, C, and D. I'm not sure how one squares the circle about any of this, but the question then is, can one actually bring, in the process of highlighting the suffering and these lives, are you making them real, or are you dehumanizing them? Are you turning them into caricatures? These are unpopular questions, and certainly questions that writers do not like to ask themselves. Neither do human rights activists, by the way. So let's all engage in a little bit of self-loathing, and I would be more than happy, please, if you would converse rather than do this.
Unfortunately, if the answer is that we should feel guilty or there's not much consequence in writing about things and hearing about things, then we may as well all just pack up and go home. Because all of us here today, one way or another, are part of this business. And I think I would emphasize what Hanif Selma so eloquently said this morning in his tour de force through Pakistani culture, history, and politics, is that everyone has a right to know the truth. Most of all, the young, who are the future, have a right to know the truth. And if we believe that in democracy, information, knowledge is power, then the fact that there is Human Rights Watch, the fact that there are novels who reach out to audiences who don't read Human Rights Watch, it may not change the situation, but if it changes the mind of even a few people in the audience, then I think it's not for naught. I do agree with Mohammed that the best and really the only form of resistance is actually resistance itself, and not just writing about the resistance. But I think changing people's minds is a very complex process, and I think the process of speaking out about it and being seen to speak out about it is absolutely crucial.
You feel this huge burden that you should be doing everything and really you can do very little. I've had people say to me, it's a third intifada of art and writing, and it's like, come on, really can't do anything very much on our own. It has to be part of the process. And I did, start by saying that, part of my ambition with my book was to present Palestine to be, people who didn't understand it. And you work with so many competing ideas about who you're writing for, why you're writing it, how you're going to got to a point where I really just felt that if all I'm doing is writing this for 5 people who are close to me, who've been through this with me and understand this like me, and it gives them some comfort about these weird situations sometimes whether it's having siblings being in London and having, being kind of having anyone raise their eyebrows because they're getting far too agitated at dinner parties, or whether it's, what you're meant to be doing at home. I mean, I don't know that a novel now is going to lead people to go out into the streets and maybe a Twitter storm might. But, it's part of a sort of sense that I think of it more of a building of internal resistance. You know who you are, you know where you're from, you know other people who are, suffering the way you do it. It's a part, it's sort of consolation and comfort to others who are in strange,
I think a lot of it has to do with the stuff of your context, where you are. I was teaching at Berkeley University last year, and there were 10 students. I was doing a creative writing workshop. And as it happens, there were all girls, and I asked where are the boys. They said, hey, used to 5 person, now they're all studying computer skills. So, and the brightest of them, Lena, I still remember her name, she used to, sort of write brilliant stuff, like one of those gifted people, She would just give her an assignment, within half an hour, she'd sort of turn up a brilliant piece of fiction. But since then, I've been following her, and she's hasn't written any fiction at all. She's very active on all the websites. She writes for Al Jazeera. She writes brilliantly. But and I've asked her a couple of times. She said, there's no way that I can, sort of take even a day off and sit at my desk and think about something that would sort of fascinate me enough. So sometimes people do get kind of caught up in whatever is, as Shahid said, whatever is happening around them. That even if they wanted to, they can't. But the question that you asked earlier, I did really think about it, especially in this with this Belos missing number. But this was a very specific context, because people have been coming to Lahore, outside Press Club 3 months, Islamabad 3 months, Karachi 3 months. So there's sort of a young, educated girl who's sitting there every day in the protest time. What does he want? He wants a brother back. Before that can happen, what does he want? He wants you guys, press, to pay any attention. Do we pay any attention? No. So I didn't have that problem. I said, they want to talk to people, so I'll talk to them and I'll try and see if there are other people who are willing to talk to them. So that was very complicated. But the other thing that you said, that do you kind of objectify them? I mean, are you being voyeuristic? And I used to ask when I would sit and chat with them and listen to these horrible stories, what exactly is it that I'm interested in? And it occurred to me one day, I had this horrible thought. Basically, actually, I'm interested in torture. Because even in my novels, there are these random torture scenes. I thought maybe I'm educating myself on the latest torture techniques. And that was horrifying thought. You kind of, doubt yourself, you question yourself. I don't think I learned much in the process.
This question about objectifying and breaking, it's a question of pleasure. I have visited this. When I hear about Balochistan, it's like home. We can say it in a way, it's like education, politics, and it will work exactly like Kashmir. But, I remember the first time I actually saw the woman back from Bina, there's an association of persons, parents of disability persons, I remember as a, 2001, I was working in the journalism area, and I saw her at one of the major social institutions. Some activists invited them to give a talk. And this woman was come out of a context, a small place, in a big city, which is actually hostile to her. And there's some people who are sympathetic and trying to give her a space. But I was very troubled, and it's really disturbed me. I did at that moment feel that it is a degree of objectification. That maybe we should go to her, listen to her in her own context and tell her story, and rather than push them count for something, but I think there is a great degree of, I think we, given as writers, or whether it's a public event, we have to, that degree of respect and being conscious of the fact of the class and the power dynamic there is something very, very important in such situations. If we are patronizing when it comes to writing or interaction with a person who's survived a calamity or that kind of injustice, it will be no worse than perpetrators. I remember when I wrote my first I was in Karachi, and obviously all the stories back then were about violence, so it was like, peace about this violence. It had some really graphic pictures of some dead women in it. And my mother couldn't read or write, so I kind of took the magazine to her just to kind of show off that now I have a job, and she kind of went through it. And she was really genuinely surprised. She said, can you actually make a living printing dead women's pictures? What kind of job is that? So I always kind of remember that what we're doing is it kind of, what exactly is it that we're trying to do?
As a novelist, you said something very interesting earlier. You said that basically it's all politics for it to have meaning. Now, the point is, and this takes me back to the title of our talk, which is literature of resistance. What makes something literary? Does it have to be political? Can there be something that is of great literary or linguistic merit, which is devoid of politics? Is there? I ask. I put this out because I think that this is a question that deserves an answer, because normally what we do is that either we are in sympathy with the politics of a writer, or we are not in sympathy with the politics of a writer. And if a writer says to you that, well, I wish to depict to you the physicality of the world without seeking to judge it, which I think is a rather difficult thing to pull off, let us say, that they do, judgment-free writing. Are you suggesting that, therefore, that judgment-free writing, where there isn't even an implicit judgment, is of no consequence and of no value, regardless of the beauty of its construction? I would like all of you to address this, because I think that there is this perpetual struggle between the idea of what, basically about what constitutes meaning, and I think that particularly for the novelist, there is room to explore this. Certainly, if you're writing non-fiction, you are writing about specific things. If you're reporting about specific things. But actually, as a novelist, you can conjure up a world that says nothing at all, necessarily, about your contemporary reality or where you're coming from. Or am I wrong? I mean, getting into that included, that's also fine.
You can argue that everything is political and that can be made case. You look at some texts and say that they are, devoid of political content. I mean, I think the key test is the way that fiction works really is that emotionally communicates or somehow able to convey a reality across a fictive stage across. With regard to the question about objectifying, so to go back a bit, I think there's such often people we're dealing with that either unseen or so objectified or demonized that really probably can be very sensitive about this issue of whether you're possibly running a risk. And I think there's enough sensitivity within the individual writer you can deal with it. It's each writer's consent. But with
it's an interesting question about trying to define what is resistance and then focusing on the question of what is political, because I think we live in a world where so much that is personal is political, because we live in societies where the state is so much involved in so many aspects of our life. So now someone's sexuality is political because it's about their personal freedom, someone's religion, someone's desire to live on one piece of land rather than on another piece of land. So it's sometimes very hard to define like what is your personal private space and what is the domain of more conventional political space. And I think what Selma was talking about, the plight of the Palestinian artist or writer, and I remember in Palestine when I lived there in the 90s, how some of the artists wanted to do still lifes, bowls, fruit. And people would come and say, well, what's this about? And they'd say, it's art. And they'd say, but it doesn't have anything to do with the Israeli occupation. And the artist would say, I don't want to write about the Israeli occupation. I just want to do still life. And they were made to feel that this was of no consequence. And I think this brings us back to your earlier point that you started off with, Ali, about and this is the danger about resistance and writing and Human Rights Watch reports, is that the resistance can actually be appropriated to be part of the propaganda. So that in some societies it's a safety valve. The regime lets them talk about it, they'll feel good about it, but we don't have to do anything about it. And we saw this, just one last point, about in Palestine, because an absolutely seminal moment in terms of the literature across the Middle East was the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the partition of Israel and Palestine, because it gave rise to what we call the literature of political commitment. And people who had authoritarian regimes wanted their writers to talk about Israel and dispossession and occupation rather than talking about the fact that they were living in a very, very undemocratic society. And they appropriated the Palestinian narrative instead of doing something about it. So there are the dangers, as you rightly pointed out, in the resistance and literature of resistance in terms of who uses it and how it is to be used, and whether it becomes, as Mohammed said, a substitute for action. Anyway, something I said about you.
I was distracting on food and still life. I mean, a lot of Palestinians would say that is a very political act. I mean, look at all the cultures they've lost. With my own eyes, I've seen like these fruit trees where settlers have poured acid on them. So next 20 years, we forget that. So somebody would say, yeah, sitting on and painting a still life of fruit is a political act.
Never mind.
Yeah, I mean, we can go on and on about it. But you can say that, for example, our kind of mainstream TV drama, it's kind of the child drama. One of Pakistan's most popular writers these days is a young woman called Mara Ahmed, who writes novels and writes TV plays. You watch them, and they are very, very critical. Somebody might say these are family stories. But then family is the place where kind of bitterest kind of politics happens the most harsh. Always somebody kind of giving somebody a sermon. And I watched like one of the recent episodes and I knew the rest. And I said, I mean, this is brilliant stuff. Because आप ड्रामा भी देखते हो और आपको ऐसे भी लगता है कि सवाब भी हो रहा है साथ life, family, kind of, stuff going on, but it is, I think it is all very political. And now if you ask Mara to come to this literary festival, she won't, because she's a real writer. She's not a writer. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I'm told that the time is up. According to my watch, it's 10 to. It is 10 to. So we have another 10 minutes, and I think it is now time to open this up to questions. So I will welcome questions from the audience. If there is anyone. Hello. This gentleman here raising his hand right there. Could someone?
Excuse me. Hello.
Oh, mine is with you. Okay.
My question is, it actually said that at the time of repression, you have the best form of literature or art. Now, how true would that be?
Repression. Repression breeds good art. Yes, no, maybe.
We never want to sit here and make an argument that repression is a good thing. But you have because you didn't really have something to take on, something to inspire you, something to drive you, something to make you angry, something to fuel those passions. And we've seen the same thing happening in Egypt now, for example, where there was a rush of tweeting and blogging and writing and films and extraordinary celebration at the time of the revolution. And now, one of Khalid Abdullah, you may know him as a prominent actor. He was in the he was saying that, they should have an organization called Revolutionaries Anonymous, like Alcoholics Anonymous, because they're all sort of sitting around missing the revolution. So there is something quite inspiring.
And so where has the mic traveled to now?
So I have a question for Mohammad Hanif. You were given a lot of criticism on your second play, The Dictator's Wife, and I think a lot of people hated the fact that you also talked about Zia in the case of Exploding Mangoes. So do you do it because you love criticizing him, or do you love hating him, or do you actually want to touch a nerve for the public?
That's love. I think I must have an unhealthy obsession with dictators. Talking about resistance, I think one of the kind of best examples, one of the most complex, our kind of resistance anthem for years is that Faisab's poem, Hum Dekhenge the Taj Uthare Jayenge. And, sort of, Musharraf bhi sunaye ki apne wahan mein baith ke wo bhi Taj Uthara karta tha. Same something. It was like this great kind of thing also. So sometimes the same text can, over the years can transform and become something else.
My question is to Lyse Doucet, and I would think that with the passage of time there will be less propaganda. But what we witness is that even in the freest of the societies like yours, there's so much propaganda that watching CNN sometimes makes me laugh. And the mainstream media. It's so funny that, when I was young, I used to believe that, America was a great country and they had the best media. They've gone to Iraq to free the people and all that. And now you work for BBC. How much propaganda is
that's actually a positive kind. You mentioned from BBC that you said working for BBC that I'm also leading the propaganda, or how much? On BBC. Here. I've worked with BBC for 30 years now, so you would say that I probably am not able to answer because if there is propaganda, I'm perhaps totally brainwashed. I would only say that just like all of you here in this room, you were colonized by the British. I'm Canadian, so I was colonized by both the British and the French. For my colonial imperial masters. One person's truth is another person's propaganda. All I can say is, I'm involved in an international broadcasting corporation who we do the best we can to try to get as close as possible to the truth of what happened, although I have to say that in my journalistic career was when I was in Pakistan that I decided there actually wasn't something called truth. And even on who, what, when, where, why, we couldn't actually agree on it. So up to the viewer to decide, and if you believe, and I'm sorry if you do, that what the BBC does is propaganda, then we have to do a better job of trying to describe the world as it is. I think my view on this is that the only way to try to describe the world as it is to speak to as many people as possible, with as many voices as possible. And somehow, you will never come to, it's what we say we write the first rough draft of history, and perhaps it's getting rougher and more of a draft and more hysterical than historical, but your guess. On terms of the propaganda, and we talk about writers and poets and others, but there's also been a new form of writing in our generation, and that's spin doctors. And governments have discovered and have delighted in the fact that they also want to get into this information revolution that we've been talking about. They want to get their point of view across. They want to bypass the media and talk directly to people. And the best way to do that is by spinning a tale which is approximation of the truth they would like us to hear.
Thank you. Now, as we are running out of time, we will try one last time to give Arundhati Roy her voice back.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the festival, and I'm very sorry I couldn't come. So I hope this video will sort of work at least a little way there.
Is there a message that you'd like to give the festival protest?
Well, I know that I'm one of the writers who's sort of almost ritually associated with this, the idea of literature of protest. But I'm a little bit, I would be a little bit careful about that term, because we must ask, what are we protesting against? What are we protesting for? And so perhaps I would forefront the idea of justice more. I mean, I know we have different ideas of justice, but protest runs the risk of becoming a new cool sort of middle class acquisition like an iPod or something. And we really ought to be a little more specific about that term, I think.
And you want to say something about what it means to be a writer in South Asia today?
That's a tough question, I think even though things are bad in India, it's probably easier to say what you think, even though it's not easy, but still, compared to what's happening in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, I think it's very, very difficult there and in those places, and of course in Bangladesh as well, but it's becoming almost as bad here. There are goons on the streets who are sort of imposing a kind of censorship, and there's all sorts of games going on about it. How do we continue to say what we want? Sometimes we can't say it straight, so we have to find tangential ways of saying it. Very importantly, we have to survive in this atmosphere because, of course, there are people very eager to co-opt writers and take them to their protection and then use them as ammunition against their people, their communities. So I think it's very important for us to live here, to think here, and continue to be able to say what we want. Sometimes we have to find tricks, we have to find ways of saying it. Sometimes we have to retreat, sometimes we have to move forward. It's not easy, but I think between us we have to find ways of managing because things are crowding in.
Thank you very much.
That was Arundhati Roy resisting the Lahore Literary Festival by not showing up. And thank you, Mohammad Hanif.